You're watching Act.tv. I'm Julianna Forlano. Lawmakers and activists are working together to make real changes in policing that are worth celebrating, but it's important to name the statements that are, opportunistic and performative, like police officers taking a knee with protesters before proceeding to pepper spray them. Here to talk more about why these faux actions are so insidious is Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, New York Times bestselling author, professor in the college degree program offered to the New York State prisoners by Rutgers University, ordained Presbyterian minister, author of 12 books, including Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, and The Death of the Liberal Class, which was one of my personal favorites, and a new book coming out, America, the Farewell Tour. Chris Hedges is here with us today. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Sure, thank you.
The last time you were here was, where we only had the pandemic of COVID to deal with, and we weren't actively dealing with the pandemic of police brutality. It's good to have you back on our program.
Thanks.
You recently wrote a piece that listed multiple performative acts of faux solidarity, like police officers taking a knee with the protesters, the NFL giving a public apology. Let's talk about why we need to be wary of these kind of symbolic actions.
Because we've seen it all in the past. There have been, eruptions, Ferguson, Freddie Gray, Eric Garner, and we get the same story, which are promises of reform. But if you go all the way back to the Johnson administration, and Naomi Mirakawa does a good job of chronicling this in her book, The First Civil Right, how liberals built the prison America, how liberals built prison America, you see that all of these efforts to, create civilian review boards or put body cameras on, or requiring officers to intervene. The Minneapolis Police Department had established a duty to intervene after Brown was killed in Ferguson in 2014. It didn't do anything to save Floyd. All of these reforms, and this, of course, is what Biden is calling for. He's calling for $300 million more towards police, have only made these forces less accountable and more lethal. But I think what's so kind of disturbing to watch is the obvious gaslighting by, including, I would count most of the Black political elites in the midst of the protests. So, you got Nancy Pelosi wearing a Kente scarf as a political prop. You get Biden, who was the architect of the 1994 crime bill that doubled our prison population, tripled and quadrupled sentences, increased mandates for death penalty eligible crimes, put 100,000 more people on the cops on the streets. Speaking at George Floyd's funeral, of course, you mentioned the NFL, although I haven't seen anybody rehire Colin Kaepernick. You get the mayor of Washington, Muriel Bauer, who has Black Lives Matter painted in 35-foot tall letters on a street near the White House at the same time that she's proposed a $45 million increase in the police budget and the construction of a new $500 million jail.
Chris, question for you.
Yeah.
When these folks like the mayor of DC say we're proposing another, billions of dollars police budget for police reform, do they say they believe that reform is the way to go? I mean, I'm certainly not defending Joe Biden's record at all, but it seems like all these people know how to do is throw money at the problem. And we've seen that the throwing money at police reform in whatever way doesn't seem to work. The protesters have won a victory here in New York, the 50A statute that keeps policemen's record or police people's records of malfeasance private has been overturned. What do you think about that particular victory?
I don't think it's a victory. I think that nobody's addressing the fundamental problem, which is that you have impoverished and abandoned huge areas, especially in former manufacturing centers in cities. and thrown these people, discarded, what Marx would call surplus labor, onto the street. And so you need two bulwarks of social control. One are militarized police, which can revoke habeas corpus and due process and kick down your door in the middle of the night, for nonviolent drug offenses with long-barreled weapons and Kevlar vests, and the prison system. And until we address the underlying social dislocation that has essentially pushed people outside the economy. I mean, the only way to get work is mostly in the illegal economy, which of course funnels you right back into the jails and the prisons. We should also be clear that these are money-making operations in two senses. One, city budgets, because of the decline in corporate taxes. I mean, Amazon didn't even pay federal taxes last year. The shortfalls in city budgets are made up through fines, 30%, for instance, in St. Louis County, where Ferguson is. So you're fined for invented crimes, loose cigarettes. Eric Garner strangled to death. He wasn't even selling loose cigarettes that day, by the way. Open containers, not mowing your lawn, obstructing pedestrian traffic, which means standing too long on a sidewalk. And so you have, this kind of constant, police in poor neighborhoods, and because also of quotas, because if they fulfill quotas, they get federal drug money in the quote unquote war on drugs. So, and because they want to keep the crime statistics down, they're not actually investigating real crime, but it's these kind of invented crimes that are meted out against the poor. So we're not dealing with the structural issues, nor are we looking at the history of quote unquote reforms going back decades that have only made the police less accountable, more lethal. And so that's the problem. I mean, it is good that we ban, chokeholds. And, I think we also, the other issue that we haven't discussed or dealt with is how do we break the power of police unions, which in cities like Philadelphia are just white hate groups. In New York State alone, police unions gave $7 million to candidates, and they've given Cuomo $600,000 during his gubernatorial runs. They also give money to back public prosecutors that do their bidding. So there are, serious structural issues that we're not talking about. Now, all of that said, I would say that, my sense is that the people in the streets get it, that this is a class and generational conflict that goes far beyond policing reforms. I don't think they're buying, for instance, Bauer's 35-foot tall letters. I think and we have the antecedents of this with Black Lives Matter, who've been working at this for years, and they've certainly figured out how gamed the system is.
Chris, what do you think that the protesters should? Oh, bless you. So the 50A statute, as you've pointed out, what it seems like you're saying is like it's basically just tinkering with the problem. But the marchers see it as a victory, or some of them at least see it as a victory. How can we continue to build victory after victory after victory? What do you suggest that the activists in the street push for?
Well, I mean, look, two demands, both of which come out of Black Lives Matter, are abolishing or defunding the police. That's what's under discussion. Defunding the police, they can play with numbers all day long. You're watching de Blasio do it, promising to put, the budget of the New York City police is $6 billion a year. Most cities spend half of their spending on cops. So you can play a numbers game. Once you start, as the city council has done in Minneapolis, calling for the abolition of police, that's something very different. Because what you're doing is removing one of the pillars of support of the corporate state. And I would argue that, we don't live in a functioning democracy, that the ruling class, especially after the CARES Act, where they just pillaged once again, as they did in 2008, 85% of that money goes towards corporations, the cruise industry, the airline industry, There was an article in the New York Times the other day about these incredibly wealthy hospitals that are sitting on billions of dollars of cash, getting money from the CARES Act. At the same time, they're furloughing or laying off nurses and doctors. So this is an issue that goes far, far beyond calls for reform, which are victories. I'm not dismissing it. But my sense is that that it's going to be very hard this time around to gaslight the people in the streets because, and of course we've seen, and that's one of the signs of hope. It's a very diverse group. A lot of white people are out there, young white people, but they also have been pushed out of the economy. There's burdened, many of them, by massive amounts of student debt. We're talking about, these are government statistics, 25% unemployment this summer. The moratorium on evictions will be lifted, so people will be thrown out of their homes. The stimulus checks were a tokenism. They got burned up immediately to pay rent or credit card companies. In July, the unemployment, the $600 is gone. So I think we're barreling towards a crisis that goes far, far, far beyond, police reforms. I think people have realized that the entire system, that we live in a kind of corporate kleptocracy, mafia state. I sense that this awareness is going to keep people, especially as the economic situation deteriorates for large numbers of people. Remember, you have 43 million people that have lost their employee-sponsored health insurance. I mean, so and the state has just not responded at all in a way that is rational.
You've likened the way the ruling class treats poor people of color to an abusive partner using gaslighting tactics, and you just spoke about gaslighting a minute ago. Can you expand upon what you mean by that?
Yeah, it's all symbolic. You go back to the 1994 Violent Crime and Law Enforcement Act. This was supported by the Congressional Black Caucus. And I think that's just one early piece of evidence that shows the disconnect between the Black political elites and those they should protect. And so what's the caucus done in the current crisis? They've called for the same tired and toothless reforms that got us into the predicament we're in. There was a good piece by Kianga Yamada Taylor in the New York Times where she essentially called this out. She said Black elected officials have become more adept at mobilizing the tropes of Black identity, have become adept at mobilizing the tropes of Black identity without any of its political content. And that's what's happened. But I'm not sure it's going to work this time around. And let's talk about Biden. Biden was one of the architects of all of this.
And then he wants to get Stacey Abrams on and be like, look, I like Black people. You know what I mean?
You got to go back and look at what the 1994 bill did. It was atrocious. I mean, I teach in a prison in New Jersey, in the prison system through Rutgers, as you mentioned. Half of my students wouldn't be in there but for Joe Biden and Bill Clinton. Remember, half of the people in our prison system, we have 25% of the world's prison system, we're 4% of the world's population, that's 2.3 million people, have never been charged with physically harming another person. 94% never had a trial. They were coerced to plea out. And so what did the 94 bill do? Well, it was an effort to wrest back the issue of quote unquote law and order from the Republicans, but it was awful. It was $30.2 billion for over 6 years for police and prisons. Biden bragged at the time about increasing federal statutes to over 50 death penalty eligible crimes. He bragged about 70% increase a 70 number, 70 increase in penalties and new offenses covering violent crimes, drug trafficking. He established the community-oriented policing services. This is the COPS program. That gave $14 billion to states and local governments to hire more cops, mostly. It also allocated $1 billion to put police in schools, which accelerated the whole criminalization of kids. It was horrific. And the idea that the Democratic Party coughs up a figure like Biden at this moment, assuming that we're going to vote for him because he's not Trump.
Mm-hmm.
They tried that in 2016, didn't work out too well.
It's like they're running Hillary. Your piece ends by saying there's only really one way to defeat the forces of occupation and the ruling elites they protect. This is a quote from your latest piece. It's not through voting. It will come from the streets, which we see people in the streets now. But why not both? We just interviewed a slate of DSA candidates in New York. Shouldn't we be contributing to their momentum and help their power increase?
Yeah, well, I vote. It's not, but change doesn't come through voting. Change always comes from the streets. Change always comes by mobilized, organized people pitting power against power. This is why Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States is such an important book. He illustrates from the beginning that it was all the labor unions, the civil rights movement, the abolitionists, the suffragists. That's what opened up American democracy. It doesn't open up by itself. It has a natural tendency to close, which it has done since the early 1970s, to protect the ruling class and the ruling elites. So go ahead and vote. And I haven't voted for a Democrat since before 2000, as you may know. I was Ralph Nader's speechwriter. But I think too often, I don't think this is necessarily true, by the way, of the younger generation, but the older, the idea that you go into a voting booth and you spend 10 minutes pulling a lever and you've done your civic duty is essentially to surrender power. We haven't talked about the whole Bernie Sanders phenomenon. I think a lot of these kids in the street, kids, they're in their 20s and 30s, have got burned. I mean, they got burned by the Democratic Party hierarchy, who, as in 2016, railroaded Sanders out of the nomination. And you had this whole thing about the least worst. Well, that only applies to us because you had Lloyd Blankfein and all these rich Democratic Party donors on record in the New York Times saying if Sanders was the nominee, they would vote for Trump. And essentially the ruling class, there's no way that they're going to lose in this election. Biden will serve their interests and Trump will serve their interests. Yes, they prefer Biden in the same way they preferred Clinton. Trump's an embarrassment and he's inept and all that kind of stuff. But look, the tax cuts, the increase in the military budget, the deregulation, both Trump and Biden have long track records they used to call Biden Senator Credit Card because he worked for the largest credit card company in the world in Delaware, which, by the way, his son Hunter also had a very, a well-paid job working for them before he decided to go to the Ukraine.
We're speaking with author and journalist Chris Hedges. Chris, you wrote that the capitalist class wants to keep the working class in a state of constant distress. Or actually, I heard you say that on the Jimmy Dore show in a recent interview that you did with him. Do you think that the capitalist class is benefiting in some way from the uprisings and the civil unrest we see in the streets right now, other than the fact that they can, demonize Black people as hooligans and people who break stuff, etc.?
Right. So, let's be clear that there's two tactics in terms of responding to what's happening in the streets. You have the kind of friendly fascism tactic where, you essentially express your support, your repugnance at racism. This is what Bertram Gross in his book Friendly Fascism calls the nice guy mask, which you use to disguise the despotism of corporate power and the ultra rich. And then you have the, get the hobnail boot and smash it onto their head response of the Trump administration. Those are the only, so there are two responses by the ruling elites. And neither one is working. I don't think that I think the popular kind of outrage towards police violence, which doesn't stop. We just had another killing in Atlanta. There's no control, and even among people who might be sympathetic to the law and order approach, the indiscriminate lethal force, which is not a new experience if you live in a poor community of color. 1,100 people are murdered every year by police, almost all of them unarmed. And then, of course, many, many more injured and beaten. It's just become so egregious. It's kind of hard to deny.
Chris, do you
But you have
think
two responses from the ruling elites.
that some of what we're seeing now, the additional killings of right in the middle of the protests, do you think? I mean, there are two African Americans hung in California.
Yeah.
Do you think there is some signaling going on here that is, between members of the KKK cops? Do you know what I mean? Like, do you think this is signaling, or do you just think this is just happening because this is how it happens, and now we're seeing it?
Well, I mean, what did they have? They ruled. They've ruled these things as suicides, right? These hangings, I believe. Uh, Look, I mean, as Tim DeChristopher said when he got out of prison, this was the guy who bid on public lands
Yeah.
to stop oil drilling, even though he didn't have any money. So they sent him to federal prison for, I think, 20 months. Somebody asked him when he got out, did you meet people in prison who you thought would be in prison? He said, yeah, I met about 50 people and 10 of them were prisoners. You take traumatized Afghan, Iraqi war vets, pump them up on steroids, put them in a prison. It's a job where you can thrive quite well if you're a sadist. So yeah, there is, of course, we know crossover between these white hate groups and the military and the police. We just saw it in New Jersey with these corrections officers taunting a Black Lives Matter protest by kneeling on a neck, and saying, this is what you're going to get, this is what the cops are going to give you. I mean, yes, it's there. I mean, I'm not going to speculate as a reporter because I don't know. But yes, and I think that as the situation deteriorates economically, socially, as Trump becomes more beleaguered, if these protests continue, then you will see, we're already seeing incitement to violence, but you will see much more active, much more proactive efforts to incite violence. And, we're already seeing these photos of these white armed hate groups standing on the steps of state capitals with what are in essence assault weapons, lining roads as Black Lives. That reminds me very much of the former Yugoslavia. I covered the war there, where it doesn't take much. I mean, you first get people to speak in the language of violence, and then they commit violence. So I worry that as we devolve, as the situation devolves, as the ruling class continues to loot the U.S. Treasury on behalf of themselves. I mean, we have this giant slush fund, $500 billion, which can be leveraged 10 to 1, creating staggering sums of money to serve their own, and there's no accountability, to serve their own interest. The social fabric could really, and especially because within American DA, there's such a propensity of violence, the social fabric could disintegrate in very frightening ways. I think the possibility of sectarian violence is very, very real. And by this summer, we could begin to see, we already, of course, see all the mass shootings, and which is, a kind of, Durkheim called evidence of a kind of anomie or rupturing of social bonds. I'm very worried about where we're headed.
As I believe we all are. A question from the chat from Dr. Bwin. Outside of the current BLM protests, what does Chris think is the most effective way to achieve change and replace the current leadership of the parties?
I don't know that we can replace the current leadership of the parties, which have been captured by corporate power. I think that the only hope is to wrest power back from corporate hands, and that will only come by massive street protests, the kind of protests that I covered as a reporter in Eastern Europe, that brought down the Stasi regime in East Germany, the communist government in Czechoslovakia, Ceausescu in Romania. I'm not saying that we can do it, but I don't see that it's possible to reform the system from within. They're utterly tone deaf, at least to us. There is no way within the American political system to vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs. It doesn't matter whether Trump is in office or Clinton's in office or Obama's in office. So, but the ruling elites are clearly worried, as they should be. I sense that there's a sophistication among people out in the streets where they're not going to be gaslighted again. And I think as the protests continue, there will be a natural kind of political maturation, which I also saw in Eastern Europe. When they began protesting in Leipzig, was mostly led by Lutheran clergy, and their one demand was that the communist government give them legal status, recognize their legitimacy as an opposition group. By the end, Honecker and the communist government didn't exist. So I think we really have to, and I think we will see that. But I think that we have to really confront the roots of social inequality and the mafia state, and defy it. But it isn't going to happen within the Democratic Party. And I sense that a lot of people who place their faith in the Democratic Party by working for the Bernie Sanders campaign have figured that out.
To get back to the topic that we started off with, the statements that are being made by corporations and police being opportunistic and performative. Can you tell me what your particular response was? Like, how many times did you vomit when you saw Amazon putting up a Black Lives Matter banner on their site, less than 1 month after they let the warehouse employees, get sick with COVID?
Right. Well, that's the perfect example right there. The very forces that are part of the repressive apparatus, that have commodified Black bodies, and created the carceral state, are, weeping crocodile tears over murders that should not be taking place. So yeah, but that's just writ large across all of the ruling elites. That most of the ruling elites, you have obviously that segment of Bill Barr and Trump that are, they're just the only thing they don't have on is the hood.
It seems like Amazon is like, we don't want you to shoot Black people in the street, but we'll underpay them. We will not let them wear protective equipment when they're working at Whole Foods during a pandemic because we don't want it to look weird, and all the other things that they do. I mean, Amazon was oppressing their workers since way before the pandemic happened.
They always have, and they're union busters, and they make people work 12 hours, and they won't pay their medical bills. And Bezos, of course, is the richest man in the world. Amazon didn't pay any federal taxes last year and got a tax rebate. The billionaire class has increased their wealth during the pandemic by $434 billion. Bezos by over $30 billion. What do we have to see? Amazon's a good example. We have to see what we have been seeing, which are strikes at Whole Foods and at Amazon. That's where the power is. That's where the power to affect change lies. And
I spoke to Professor Richard Wolff, and he said that he is seeing evidence that unions are starting to get involved, starting to march with the Black Lives Matter movement. What do you think what do you think about that? What do you think the outcome of that?
Well, that's key. You've got to, and this was part of the problem in the 60s, is you had popular unrest, but it wasn't united with labor. Labor had been co-opted, the AFL-CIO, they all cheerleaded Nixon's war in Indochina and denounced the hippies in the streets. So once you bring labor into the equation, even if it's unorganized in the sense that you have frontline workers who don't yet have a union, that becomes key. Look, the Amazon employees have the ability to extract severe punishment on Bezos and Amazon. They have that ability, and that's what we're going to have to see. We're going to have to see those kinds of strikes. That's what will affect change, because in essence, you bound the hands of the ruling elite. Now, if that starts to happen, you will see all these people who claim to support social justice and turn immediately to the state to use draconian forms of control to essentially throw militarized police at the problem, and the mask will drop. But that's our only hope. Our only hope is to begin to cripple the system to make it respond.
What did you think about when the military leaders got together and say, no, Trump, we're not going to go into our own cities? Your thoughts about that?
Yeah, look, the U.S. military is the face of white supremacy beyond our border. I know. I spent 20 years covering them in wars, 7 years in the Middle East. So they go into countries and steal natural resources and exploit cheap labor with the kind of idea that they're going to liberate the people of Iraq or free the women of Afghanistan. It's that white man's burden. It's racist. You see it among the way soldiers and Marines refer to people they occupy, ragheads and sand, the N-word, et cetera, et cetera. And we can't overlook the importance of empire as a contributor to the problems that we're in. There's the military doesn't want to be out on the streets because I think it has an 80% of positive approval rating within the American public, since nobody sees what they do in places like Syria or anywhere else. So they don't want anyone to disrupt the kind of empire that they have created internally within the empire that can't even be audited.
So you believe the reason that they said no was not for some purpose of saving democracy? It was
because they already know very well that we have militarized internally. We have forces of domestic control that are completely militarized in Homeland Security and the FBI and the police. So you don't need to bring in the 101st Airborne. That will just turn the American public against the military. That's what this is about. It's not that they love democracy. I mean, they are, as Karl Liebknecht once called the German military, the enemy within. And they have been probably, as an institution, most responsible for the death of American democracy because they've siphoned out all of the resources, disproportionate amount of the resources and money from the state for these futile and endless wars. I mean, these generals and politicians should at the very least be investigated and probably put on trial. And so as you hollowed out the country from the inside, this is what always happens with empire. The brutal forms of control and tactics that they test on people of color in places like the Middle East, you can go back to Vietnam, all the way back to the Philippines, are then brought back home. So, militarized police, surplus military equipment handed out to police departments. That's how you get armored personnel carriers in Ferguson with 50 caliber machine guns pointed at unarmed protesters, wholesale surveillance, militarized drones. All of those things are a feature of empire. And that's how empires in their final stages decline. As Thucydides wrote it during the Peloponnesian War, the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. We're not going to have, and Martin Luther King was adamant about this, racial justice until we have economic justice and until we slay the beast of empire. And so, I mean, I think that what what they did with Trump was they saw it, the rest of the military leadership saw it as very foolish because it's unnecessary and also detrimental to the fact that they get everything they want. The Democrat, there's no debate. There used to be, a couple decades ago, you'd at least debate weapons systems. Now the Democrats and the Republicans give them everything. Anything they want, they get.
Chris, two more quick questions because we have a second guest coming on. The toppling of the racist statues. We were talking about how Amazon and other corporations are doing sort of a PR job in terms of getting on board with Black Lives Matter for PR purposes so they can sell more crap. But on our side, or on the side of justice, getting rid of the racist statues is also symbolic. Your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's important. I mean, because, and I think it points to the fact that this is a more sophisticated or a wider movement that is really addressing the kind of roots of racism and economic inequality. So Carl Becker, the historian, pointed out correctly that history is what the present chooses to remember about the past. That these monuments are expressions of power, contemporary power. Who has the power to choose how history is remembered in public places? And of course, most of these monuments were put up in the early part of the 20th century to reinforce the reign of terror that African Americans endured under lynching and its selective memory. So that you have lots of statues of Robert E. Lee or Nathan Bedford Forrest, who founded the KKK, but you don't have any statues of Lieutenant General James Longstreet, who was one of the most important generals in the Confederacy, because after the Civil War he endorsed male suffrage. He commanded the Metropolitan Police Force of New Orleans, which in 1874 engaged in armed combat against white supremacists who wanted to seize control of the state government. So Longstreet's not a symbol of white supremacy, and so therefore he's invisible. And you have Brian Stevenson's trying to change this, but you have where are the monuments to the victims of lynching? Where are the monuments to those courageous freedom fighters, Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and Harriet Tubman? Where are the monuments to the great Black figures who rose up during Reconstruction? They're not there. And I think it's not a tangential issue because by taking down these statues, we are essentially attacking a current power structure, not a past structure, but a current power structure, as Becker points out, that essentially seeks to legitimize its power by distorting and misrepresenting history.
We're speaking with Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, New York Times bestselling author. Chris, you have a new book coming out, America, the Farewell Tour.
It's already out. It's already out.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I'm writing a book now. I'm writing another one. I never stop.
You're working on another one. I got my signals crossed there. You can follow Chris on Twitter at Chris Lynn Hedges, Lynn. Chris,
and this article that you referred to, Gaslighted by the Ruling Class, that's up on, since we've all been fired from TruthDig now, that's up on Sheer Post or Popular Resistance.
Last time you were on, we talked about how you all got fired from TruthDig,
yeah,
and then the lady
we tried to form a union at a progressive website. So there
the lady in charge of TruthDig, whoever that was, wrote me a very long letter saying that everything you said was. I'm like, okay, thanks for writing. What am I going to say? I don't,
Right.
So she must be following you around to try to undo what it is you're doing. Anyway,
well, she posted a post called "Breaking My Silence," and then when several hundred people wrote in not buying her BS, she took down all the comments. So
yeah,
it's just one of these. I mean, the Young Turks went through this. It's these rich oligarchs who express all sorts of liberal and progressive values, except when it concerns them. So
we have to
anyway,
go.
It was I and the entire editorial staff. She tried to fire the editor-in-chief, Bob Scheer, a series of unfair and probably illegal labor abuses, especially towards the copy desk. And they wanted to form she wouldn't even talk to us. I mean, there was no dialogues. There was no. Started March 11th, and about 2 weeks later, we all lost our job. So,
well, where can people go to read that piece, Gaslighted by the Ruling Class?
So it's on Sheer Post. This is the little site Bob started after we all got fired, or Popular Resistance.
Excellent. Chris Hedges, I'm sorry that you were right about everything. It's great to have you here, though, and we hope you'll come back. Your voice is very important right now, so thank you so much for being here.